Generally speaking, when players throw down their hard-earned cash for a new title, they like to have a good idea of what they're getting themselves into. I mean, it's just cost them 70 quid, and I think that's a pretty reasonable stance to take. But at the same time, it probably isn't fair to expect game developers, who at the end of the day are mostly artists rather than business folk, to keep playing the predictable hits forever for fear of alienating less adventurous gamers. Therefore, you end up sometimes with a title that has pretty predictable gameplay elements and then out of nowhere will hit you with something so unexpected it will leave your mouth completely agape. I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 intense shifts in gameplay that came out of nowhere. Number 10. The Descendants, Uncharted. For the overwhelming majority of its playtime, the original Uncharted is a heightened, yet mostly realistic action-adventure romp that, while fundamentally silly, is still tethered mostly to some semblance of our own tangible reality. But in the late-game chapter, The Heart of the Vault, Naughty Dog decided to take a sharp and totally untelegraphed turn into supernatural survival horror territory. This chapter introduces the Descendants, a fleet of feral, undead, demonic monsters descended from Spanish colonists. The terrifying set-piece that follows sees Nate and company desperately fending off the attacking creatures, which can make short work of you if you're not paying attention. For a game that's otherwise a pretty breezy time, it left many scratching their heads. Now, this isn't to say that supernatural nonsense is totally out of place in a series that is very clearly inspired by Indiana Jones of all things, but it was an unmistakable shift in genre and tone from the more grounded, controlled chaos of what came before. Despite the divisive response though, most subsequent games in the series also featured a noted supernatural element. Number 9. Attack of the Flood, Halo Combat Evolved. The first half of the original Halo's campaign is a pretty straight-up sci-fi military shooter, propelled forward on the strength of its breathtaking environments, pitch-perfect combat, and thoroughly entertaining vehicular interludes. But then Bungie decided to introduce the Flood. The mid-game chapter, 343 Guilty Spark, is a masterful exercise in slow-burning suspense, as players become increasingly aware that they're about to encounter something horrific before they're finally set upon by a fleet of parasitic critters. Like Uncharted, the game switches gears into eerie horror territory at this point, though that feeling of dread persists far longer than it did in Naughty Dog's action-adventure title. 343 Guilty Spark is then followed up by perhaps the single most infamous mission in the entire Halo franchise, the Library, a relentless, exhausting slog of a survival mission in which players must fend off against wave after wave of flood while navigating the confusingly repetitive environments. As much as fans may complain about it though, it certainly puts them in the headspace of a soldier facing insurmountable odds against a seemingly never-ending enemy. For a game that was largely marketed as an action-centric space shooter, that's quite the surprising turn. Number 8. Zombies, Skulls, and Dragons? True Crime Streets of LA. True Crime Streets of LA was one of the earlier Grand Theft Auto clones, and honestly, it's actually one of the better ones. For its first two-thirds, True Crime is a grounded open-world crime thriller transpiring within Los Angeles and its criminal underworld, until suddenly it takes a turn for the supernatural. The chapter, House of Wu, throws a zombie enemy at you that's totally unprompted, and when you finally reach the legendary Ancient Wu, he'll send some skull-faced demons your way, as well as a few ghost-like concubines for good measure, and then finally turns into a flaming dragon. Nothing in the game up to this point suggested it was ever going to head in this direction, and for many who bought the game on the basis of its similarity to earlier GTA games, it turned them off completely. Whether you could embrace the stupidity or not, it totally blindsided everyone. Number 7. The Random Space Harrier Homage, Bayonetta. Bayonetta may be a fundamentally ridiculous game, but gameplay-wise you pretty much know what you're getting. Hilariously over-the-top balletic carnage in which the titular protagonist wipes out a seemingly unending horde of beasties. But the late-game chapter, Isla del Sol, throws a spanner in the work by switching to an entirely different genre and style of play for its opening sequence. In an homage to the classic game Space Harrier, the first half of the chapter is a rail shooter, with Bayonetta riding a cruise missile to Isla del Sol as the player fends off myriad enemies, including several boss-type foes, for 10 whole minutes. Between the sheer glut of enemies thrown at the player and the scarcity of checkpoints, it's a major source of frustration for many and represents by far the most divisive single set piece in the entire game. Even if you've perfected the combat by this point, it will not do you much help here. Number 6. Max's Nightmares, Max Payne. Though the original Max Payne has a very ominous and foreboding atmosphere throughout, the gameplay is focused strictly on the titular vengeful detective mowing down literally hundreds of anonymous mooks in eye-watering beautiful bullet time slow motion. And then, those damn nightmare sequences. The bane of every Max Payne fan's existence, these intersections force the player to traipse through a blood-stained maze in the visage of Max's home where his wife and baby daughter were murdered. Max is taunted by surreal versions of that night, including the pained screams of his dying family, but worst of all, the player is also made to partake in some frustratingly imprecise platforming nonsense, leaping between thin blood trails in an all-black expanse before they can make their way out. It's fiddly and annoying, everything the otherwise drum-tight shooting gameplay absolutely isn't. Whether you can appreciate its unexpected shift in mood and gameplay or not, it's completely unforgettable. Number 5. That survival horror chapter, Final Fantasy XV. In its best moments, Final Fantasy XV is an entertainingly lightweight four-way bromance between its central cast of characters. Though more serious drama must eventually rear its ugly head, few players were surely ready for the waking nightmare that was the game's 13th chapter, Redemption. Redemption is a brutal 2 to 3 hour slog in which protagonist Noctis is stripped of his weapons and abilities and must navigate a gigantic labyrinthine industrial fortress to level up a keycard and eventually get his wares back. Though the ring he possesses will allow players to defeat enemies in a pinch, stealth and hiding are largely the order of the day, against a host of terrifying stalker-type foes who feel more like they belong in a Resident Evil game. And believe it or not, jump scares and forced stealth sections aren't something that most Final Fantasy fans have come to expect from these games, so much so that Square Enix eventually patched the game to make it considerably quicker and indeed easier. Number 4. Matrix out of nowhere, Fahrenheit. Quantic Dream's Fahrenheit was a hugely ambitious game for its era, effectively serving as a prototype for the far more refined interactive drama games that the developer would release in the future, such as Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and Detroit Become Human. Though the game makes no attempt to disguise its supernatural through line from its opening scene, nobody quite expected the ridiculous leap the game takes in its final hour. In the first 90% of the game, it's a chilly murder mystery with a heightened fantastical fringe, but in the final hour, the game shifts without warning into outright superhero nonsense. Suddenly, protagonist Lucas Kane is battling the antagonist known as the Oracle in a gravity-defying Matrix-esque battle, powered by the game's previously modest QTE sequences. In what might be gaming's quintessential, well, that escalated quickly moment, Lucas is now running along walls and evading police helicopters like it's the most natural thing in the world. Between this and the rushed last-minute love story between Lucas and Detective Carla, it's little surprise that Fahrenheit's development was expedited to meet production deadlines, resulting in large swathes of the story being cut. Had the team been able to realize their full vision, the shift to Dragon Ball Z-style fight scenes might not have seemed quite so damn silly. Number 3. The Abby Switcheroo, The Last of Us Part 2. Despite some unfortunate pre-release plot leaks, Naughty Dog did a fantastic job keeping The Last of Us Part 2's big surprise under wraps, namely that players spend close to half the game playing as the air quotes antagonist of the piece, Abby. As if Joel having his brain smashed in by Abby early on wasn't shocking enough, there's a switchover at the game's midway point where control is wrestled away from Ellie to tell Abby's story instead for most of the remainder. Despite some fans' misgivings over being unable to play the entire game as Ellie, the Abby Switcheroo offers a marked change to the prevailing gameplay. The emphasis on stealth and ranged combat in the Ellie portions is substituted for Abby's brute force close quarters melee-driven fighting style. While you'll initially feel entirely capable as Abby though, things get increasingly grueling the longer her quest goes on, ensuring that it's equally as gut-wrenching as Ellie's story, albeit in a notably different way. For a sequel that could have easily just played it safe and offered up more of the same, Naughty Dog dared to change up the format and in turn delivered what is arguably their true masterpiece. Number 2. No Russian, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Much like The Last of Us Part 2, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 could have just been more of the same cinematic FPS mayhem and ultra-addictive multiplayer and just won out easily. But instead, Infinity Ward dared to inflict no Russian upon the world. Early on in the game's single-player campaign, after a couple of entertainingly breezy missions, you'll end up going undercover with a gang of Russian terrorists as they carry out a mass shooting at an airport. Due to the shocking level of violence, players are actually able to skip through it entirely should they wish to do so, and the player is not obliged to fire a single bullet at the civilians as they move through the airport. Unsurprisingly, No Russian was immediately controversial and remains so today, but almost as jarring as its questions about player agency was the fact that it was a brutal mic drop in a game that otherwise felt like an escapist thrill ride. The mission's infamy caused Activision to include similarly provocative missions in many subsequent Call of Duty games, but none has ever matched the jaw-dropping realness of No Russian. And number 1, a most unexpected Doom homage, Toy Story. The original 1995 Toy Story game was, for the most part, a totally by-the-book movie video game title, albeit a pretty good one. The gameplay, nevertheless, consisted of exactly what you'd expect, side-scrolling platforming levels broken up with the occasional remote-controlled car vehicle level. But then there's that random Doom homage halfway through the game. When Woody and company get to Pizza Planet and end up inside the claw machine, the level really inside the claw machine tasks players with rescuing a number of plush aliens from the machine within a 3-minute time limit. But the level unfolds from a first-person perspective in a style hilariously similar to Doom, complete with similarly oppressive industrial map design. While it's fun to laugh at as an adult, as a kid the combination of the sinister aesthetic and a mean time limit actually make this a surprisingly creepy and indeed stressful level in an otherwise colourful, peppy experience. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 intense shifts in gameplay that came out of nowhere. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me over on Twitter at RetroJ0, or you can swing by Live and Let's Dice, that's Dice with a C, over on Twitch, where I do all of my streaming, and it'd be great to see you over there, my friends. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. I hope that you are treating yourself well, both mentally and physically, because you deserve the best things in life. Yes, you do, my friend. Love, happiness, and success, and do not let anyone or anything tell you otherwise. You're a massive ledge. Now go out there and smash it. I believe in ya. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye.